The grand courtroom was filled with tension, its towering wooden walls and polished floors echoing the murmurs of the gathered spectators. Judge Malcolm Reeves, a veteran known for his stern rulings, took his seat at the bench, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the room. At the defense table, Pam Bondi stood with composed confidence, her blonde hair immaculately in place, her expression calm but unyielding. Across from her, Michael Graves, a smug prosecutor with a habit of overconfidence, smirked as he adjusted his tie. "Miss Bondi, if you interrupt opposing counsel one more time, I will hold you in contempt," Judge Reeves warned, his voice carrying a sharp edge. Pam lifted an eyebrow, unfazed. "Your Honor, if I may—" "You may not," the judge interrupted, his patience wearing thin. "That's the third time in the last 5 minutes. Let Mr. Graves finish his argument." Pam leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, her sharp gaze locked onto Graves as he continued. "As I was saying," Graves resumed, his voice laced with confidence, "the statute in question clearly prohibits the defendant's actions, and case law supports our position. The precedent set in Williams versus State, that case was overturned on appeal," Pam interjected, her voice cutting through his words like a blade. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Graves hesitated for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty flashing in his eyes before he forced his composure back into place. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. Judge Reeves exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples before slamming the gavel down. "Enough, Ms. Bondi. I've had it with your disruptions. I am fining you $1,000 for contempt." A murmur spread through the courtroom, a mix of shock, amusement, and quiet approval. Graves allowed himself a small, victorious smile, convinced he had gained the upper hand, but Pam remained utterly unshaken. Without protest, without even a hint of frustration, she reached into her purse, pulled out her checkbook, and calmly wrote out a check for the exact amount. She tore it off and handed it to the bailiff with a serene expression. "Understood, Your Honor," she said simply. Judge Reeves watched her closely, something unsettled in the back of his mind. There was no anger in her face, no flustered reaction, not even the slightest trace of defeat. If anything, she looked like someone who had just set a perfect trap and was now waiting for it to snap shut. The courtroom moved on, but the judge found his thoughts drifting back to her interruptions, to her certainty. A nagging feeling took root. What if she had been right all along? Judge Malcolm Reeves sat alone in his chambers, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows over stacks of legal documents. The thick scent of aged paper filled the air, mingling with the faint bitterness of his half-drunk coffee. Outside, the courthouse halls had grown quiet, the echoes of footsteps and murmured conversations fading into the stillness of the late evening. Yet inside his mind, the events of the day replayed with sharp clarity. He tapped his fingers against the polished mahogany desk, staring at the transcript of the trial, the one that had led him to fine Pam Bondi. It had seemed so simple at the time. She had interrupted too many times, defied his authority, disrupted the courtroom's order. But now, as he skimmed through the official record, an uneasy feeling settled in his chest. His eyes landed on her most contentious interjection. That case was overturned on appeal. At the time, it had seemed like an unnecessary outburst. Another example of a defense attorney trying to derail the prosecution's argument. But now, with the courtroom's noise and tension stripped away, he saw it for what it was. Bondi had spoken up not out of defiance, but out of necessity. Reeves leaned forward, flipping open a thick legal volume from his bookshelf. His fingers traced down the list of case citations until he found Williams versus State. He frowned. It was overturned. Not recently either. Long enough ago that Graves had no excuse for citing it as if it was still valid precedent. His grip on the book tightened. Bondi had caught the mistake instantly. She hadn't even hesitated. Meanwhile, neither he nor Graves nor anyone else in the courtroom had questioned it. Reeves sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He felt something he rarely experienced in his courtroom: doubt. How many other times had Pam Bondi spoken up to correct a fundamental flaw in the case? How many of her so-called interruptions had actually been surgical strikes against legal missteps? He flipped back to the transcript, reading with fresh eyes. The pattern was clear now. Every time she had spoken, it had been at a precise moment, always to challenge a misrepresentation, a legal loophole, or an argument based on outdated precedent. She hadn't been disrespecting the court. She had been protecting the integrity of the case. A slow, sinking realization hit him. "I just find the smartest person in the room," he muttered under his breath. Reeves ran a hand down his face. He was a man of law, and if he had made a mistake, he needed to correct it. His eyes flicked toward the clock. It was late. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with hushed conversation as attorneys, reporters, and curious onlookers took their seats. Everyone had heard the rumors. Judge Malcolm Reeves had called an unscheduled hearing, and Pam Bondi was at the center of it. Pam sat at the defense table, her posture as composed as ever. She had received the call from the judge's clerk late last night, but hadn't been given details. That was fine. She had a feeling she already knew what this was about. Judge Reeves entered the courtroom, his black robe billowing slightly as he took his seat at the bench. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the room before clearing his throat. The murmurs died instantly. "This court is back in session," he announced. His tone was firm, but something had shifted, an undertone of measured respect. "Before we proceed with today's matters, I have something that needs to be addressed." The room stiffened with curiosity. Pam simply folded her hands and waited. The judge turned his attention to her, his sharp gaze locking onto hers. "Ms. Bondi, yesterday I fined you for contempt due to repeated interruptions. At the time, I believed you were being disruptive and disrespectful to this court." He paused, his fingers tightening slightly around his gavel. "However, upon review of the trial record, I have come to a different conclusion." A ripple of surprise passed through the courtroom. Michael Graves, the prosecutor, shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing where this was headed. Judge Reeves continued, his voice even. "Your objections were not baseless interruptions. In fact, they were legally sound, and in some cases necessary to correct errors in the prosecution's arguments. Most notably, your objection regarding Williams versus State was entirely correct. The case was overturned, meaning it should not have been cited as precedent." Graves's jaw tightened. Pam remained impassive, though a small flicker of amusement glinted in her eyes. She had known this all along, but watching the realization dawn on others was always interesting. Judge Reeves exhaled slowly, as if choosing his next words carefully. "It is a rare thing for a judge to admit error, Ms. Bondi, but I believe the law demands accountability from all of us. Therefore, I am reversing the contempt fine I issued yesterday, and I am formally apologizing to you for my misjudgment." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. This was unexpected. A judge admitting fault, especially in open court, was practically unheard of. Pam gave a small nod. "I appreciate that, Your Honor." The courtroom had barely settled after Judge Reeves's stunning reversal when the day's proceedings resumed, but there was a new energy in the air, an unspoken shift in how everyone, from the attorneys to the spectators, now regarded Pam Bondi. Michael Graves, the prosecutor, was perhaps the most visibly affected. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw set, his frustration barely concealed. He had walked into this trial expecting a standard legal battle, but now he was forced to reckon with the fact that he was up against an opponent far sharper than he had anticipated. The defense table remained a picture of cool composure. Pam sat back in her chair, twirling a pen between her fingers as if completely unfazed by the spectacle that had just unfolded. But she wasn't just relaxed. She was waiting, watching, calculating. Judge Reeves cleared his throat. "Mr. Graves, you may proceed with the prosecution's argument." Graves stood, adjusting his tie, clearly rattled but determined to regain control. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, picking up his notes. "The prosecution maintains that the defendant's actions constitute a clear violation of—" Pam leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharpening. Graves hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pressed on. "A clear violation of state law under People v. Carter." Pam's lips twitched. She tilted her head, waiting, giving him just enough time. To dig himself deeper, Judge Reeves frowned slightly, flipping through his own legal references. "People v. Carter," he mused, trailing off. He glanced up at Graves. "That case was decided on a procedural technicality, was it not?" Pam didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The judge was now catching the mistakes himself. Graves swallowed hard. "Well, technically yes, but the underlying principles—" Pam finally leaned forward. "Your Honor, People v. Carter does not support the prosecution's claim. The ruling was based on improper handling of evidence, which is not relevant to the facts of this case." She smiled, just a little. "I assume Mr. Graves is aware—" "Of that?" Graves' face darkened. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. "Mr. Graves, this is the second time in as many days that your argument has relied on shaky precedent." He set down his gavel with a soft but firm thud. "You are expected to present legally sound cases before this court. I suggest you take a moment to revise your argument before proceeding." Pam sat back, effortlessly victorious. She wasn't. By the time court resumed after the recess, the energy in the room had shifted entirely. What had begun as a standard legal battle had transformed into something else, something far more gripping. Pam Bondi wasn't just defending her client anymore. She had taken control of the entire courtroom. Judge Reeves re-entered, taking his seat behind the bench, his expression carefully neutral. But there was something different in the way he looked at Pam now. An acknowledgement, perhaps, that he had underestimated her. Michael Graves, on the other hand, was visibly struggling. His argument had been picked apart, his credibility shaken, and he knew it. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Your Honor, the prosecution will now proceed with our primary witness." Pam didn't react outwardly, but inside she was ready. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The bailiff opened the side door, and a man walked in, dressed in a sharp suit but looking visibly uneasy. Mark Delacroix, the prosecution's star witness. He took his seat at the stand, raising his right hand as he was sworn in. Graves stepped forward. "Mr. Delacroix, can you confirm for the court that you were present at the alleged scene of the crime on the night in question?" Delacroix cleared his throat. "Yes," Graves nodded, encouraged. "And did you witness the defendant engaging in any illegal activity?" There was a pause, a fraction of hesitation. Pam saw it immediately. Delacroix shifted. I did see something, yes." Pam slowly leaned forward, her sharp gaze locked onto him. Graves continued, clearly trying to regain confidence. "Can you describe what you saw?" Delacroix hesitated again. "I saw the defendant near the building that night." Pam finally spoke, her voice calm but cutting. "Near the building? That's not the same as committing a crime, is it, Mr. Delacroix?" Graves shot her a glare. "Objection, Your Honor. She's leading the witness." Judge Reeves, however, didn't immediately rule. Instead, he studied Delacroix, his own instincts now on alert. "I'll allow it." Pam stood, taking her time. As she approached the witness stand, "Mr. Delacroix, I have just one question for you." She stopped in front of him, locking eyes. The silence stretched. The tension in the room was palpable. Then she spoke, Would you like me to remind you of the sworn statement you gave to investigators 2 months ago? The one where you said you did not see my client do anything illegal? Delacroix visibly stiffened. Graves paled. Pam raised an eyebrow. Or would you like to correct the record before I introduce this document into evidence? A murmur rippled through the courtroom.